and welcome to the Law, Policing and Justice Department's podcast. My name is Nurin Chowdhury. I'm the lead and trainee solicitor for the Legal Advice Centre at the University of East London in Stratford. In today's episode, the first episode, we will be discussing the topic on criminology. I have with me here today Dr. Honor Dora Townsend, who's a lecturer in criminology and a presenter. I have the Level 4 student here with me today, Glory Williams, and I have here today with me Fatima Begum, who's an alumni at the University of East London and who's recently graduated. And today I'll be having the two students who will be asking the questions to Honor today. Take it away.
Hi, Dr. Honor. Please talk to us about why is everyone so fascinated by crime?
So I think the fascination with morbidity is something that has been around forever. I don't think it's anything new. I think if you look back to, even the works of Shakespeare, you have stories about love and death and tragedy. Mm-hmm. I think maybe the way that we consume those stories is very different now, of course, with social media depictions of crime, whether that's dramatizations or documentaries. But fundamentally, we've always been fascinated by these things. And I think as humans, we are just interested in trying to explain the unexplainable. We want to understand those extremes of human behavior, partially as a protective measure as well, because we want to try and understand these behaviours so that we can look out for warning signs and protect ourselves, but also just because it is so fascinating to try and understand a psyche or a set of behaviours that are so different to our own.
So we see a lot of true crime documentaries about American cases. How does this differ to the UK?
So I think the reason that we see that is because there are more serial killers in America. Even if we're looking, obviously it's a bigger country, so obviously there are going to be more, but even if we're looking proportionally, the vast majority of serial murderers across the world come from the United States. The UK also has a disproportionately high number. I think it's all quite interesting that it's predominantly Western countries where serial killers tend to stem from. But I think the key difference with maybe how they're portrayed or the kind of media content they put out around murder from the US and the UK is, in the US, there is perhaps still a bit of a level of sensationalism, I think, around things like serial murder. There have been, I won't name names, but recent dramatizations on massive platforms like Netflix about serial murderers that haven't been done particularly well, haven't received consent from family members involved, and that's something that is, I think, taken very, very seriously in the UK, and the US hasn't quite got to that point yet.
Okay.
Probably because they're so much bigger, because it's a lot harder to maybe orchestrate such a broad industry over such a large area compared to here in the UK, where it's, in my experience at least, it's becoming increasingly small. Everyone seems to know everyone that works on these things.
Wow.
Yeah.
What is it like working on true crime documentaries?
It really varies. I'll give you, I guess, a bit of backstory to how I ended up doing it. So during COVID lockdown in 2020, I had not long started my PhD. I was about 6 months into my PhD studies. And suddenly everything that I had to do about my PhD changed, right? Because I was supposed to be going into gyms and asking men in gyms who were using steroids about their masculine ideals. And suddenly I wasn't allowed to go to gyms, right? No one was allowed to go to gyms. So that kind of shifted everything on its head. And basically I had a bit more free time than I anticipated. So I started doing what I called criminology talk. So I basically started making videos about criminology on TikTok. I did that for a couple of years, and I thought that TV was maybe something I'd wanted to take a step into. I'd worked behind the scenes on TV before, and my dad actually presents TV, so I was kind of familiar with the world. And off the back of doing criminology TikTok, Channel 4 actually found me and asked me to do a YouTube series with them, which I did along with Yinka Bikini, and we talked about all these different true crime cases. And off the back of that, it kind of steamrolled, really, and I've done a lot of documentaries and podcasts and everything like that ever since. But I think the experience is always very different. It really depends on, sometimes you're what's called a talking head. So that is when, in a documentary, it'll cut to an expert who's sat in a chair looking very serious, and they'll tell you like some factual evidence about the case. Sometimes I've done more narrative storytelling along with expertise, or sometimes I've presented. So depending on what role I'm taking on, it's a very different experience. But the key thing that always happens is a lot of research before you get to the filming day.
That's right.
Obviously it makes sense, right? They'll send you lots of information, but you need to go away and do your own analysis and add your own expertise. So what's not seen is probably the 2 days that I've spent scouring Google Scholar and watching everything that I can find about that case to try and clue myself up. And also work out, ethical approaches and working with production companies on how we do that. So you'll notice actually the vast majority of true crime documentaries that you watch, most of the time, the vast majority of the time nowadays anyway, the murderer, if you're talking about a murder case, only their surname will be used, and that's a very intentional thing, whereas the victim, they will be referred to as their first name. You might introduce a murderer by their full name to start with, but then afterwards throughout it, say their surname is Smith, you will just only refer to them as Smith, and that's a very intentional thing done by production companies, kind of like a psychological message that you are giving less humanity to a perpetrator.
Wow, that's interesting.
So more on the topic of cases and presenting, why is it that documentaries cover the cases that they cover?
That's a really good question. I think that there's a number of different factors. Sometimes it can be a bit of luck, if I'm totally honest. Other times it can be that maybe if it's a historical case, maybe there's a big anniversary, maybe there's new information out there, or it's a case that hasn't been covered before. Unfortunately, though, one thing that I am critical about with regards to that is that, so in criminology, there's this thing referred to as the ideal victim hypothesis or the ideal victim theory. And that basically says that the quote-unquote ideal victim is someone who draws the most media attention. Okay. And that is a particularly biased thing as well. So they say that, for instance, it will generally be middle-class, white, quote-unquote attractive women will garner more media attention than anyone who falls out of those parameters to whatever extent. And they say that essentially because their argument in this theory, and I do think you see it play out pretty starkly, they say that it's because as a society everyone is looking for what they would refer to as a blameless victim. I'm not saying that any victims are to blame, but this is just the language within criminology. They say that essentially you're more inclined to pick up a paper and understand how this happened to someone who has maybe got no history of being involved in any sort of criminal activities or deviance, because that is so close to home for other people who are not involved in deviance, right? So they're going, how do I avoid this happening to me if it can happen to someone like that? And you see that across the board. I mean, there was a famous case years and years ago when Maddie McCann had gone missing.
Yes.
Versus, I believe it was April Jones was another girl who'd gone missing around the same time. Very different backgrounds, very different levels of privilege. And the media presence that Madeleine McCann being missing got compared to April Jones was starkly different. Unfortunately, I believe the April Jones case did turn out to be an attempted hoax, and actually there was an attempt to get money off the back of this, which doesn't help when you're trying to, use this as a case study to prove media disproportionality. But you do see, even today, the terrible, terrible things that happened to Sarah Everard, for instance. But even before we knew what had happened to her, when she was missing, everyone knew that she was missing. But there are obviously a huge amount of people who go missing all the time, but perhaps they don't match that same quote-unquote ideal victim profile. And so maybe they don't get the same kind of media attention. And also, sorry to go slightly tangent, I do that quite a lot, but that is exactly the kind of person that murderers will target, especially if you're looking at serial killers. What you'll see is that the vast majority, the reason they've got away with it for so long is that the victims that they've chosen do not match the ideal victim profile. So they might target sex workers, people with substance abuse issues, people who essentially are more vulnerable, more likely to, or less likely rather, to draw attention. So I think, I can't even remember how I got onto this, but what I always try and promote through any documentaries I'm working in is the importance of changing that narrative. So, whilst at the moment I think cases can still be disproportionately those ideal victims, I think there's definitely a drive forward at the moment in the media to broaden that out, because actually the more we do broaden that out, the less vulnerable those groups of people are going to be. The more attention that they bring, the more people that are buying the papers when anyone of any profile has gone missing or has been murdered, the less vulnerable other people in those positions are going to be. So I think there is a priority at the moment for the media to take that on board and do their part in changing that.
Okay, so what tips would you give to our aspiring criminology students who want to come and study at UEL?
Anyone that wants to study anything, my number one tip off the bat is choose something that you love, whether that's criminology or it's anything else. University is not easy. And I mean, you guys can attest to that, right?
Of course. Yeah. Of course.
There's lots of in-class learning, obviously, but the main thing is how much additional workload you have, right? All the reading, all of the watching, all of the...
They're both nodding away. They're like,
Yeah, of course.
So I think the thing that you should do at uni is whatever will make you get up in the morning and do your reading and get to your 9 a.m. classes, because if you're not that passionate about it, you're not going to do it.
It's important is reading, constantly reading, and then you'll understand the subject. That's what I believe.
Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things, like I always say in criminology, what we're talking about isn't actually that difficult. Mm-hmm. Some of the like concepts are not that difficult, but what's difficult is that we're speaking a different language. You know, it's not, I think it's the same with law, right?
It's with law as well.
Yeah,
Yes, it is.
it's actually not that complicated.
It's not.
It's just that we're using different words that the majority population do not have access to, right? Yeah. So you've got to commit to learning that language, and the way you do that is you read and you engage and you turn up and you ask questions.
That's right.
So that's the big tip, really. But otherwise, the key thing that we're doing in criminology is developing critical thinking. So if you're already thinking critically, you're ahead of the curve.
Well, from my experience, I would say, University of East London was one of the most helpful in my subject of law. And I have to thank them for all the support they have provided me. I mean, I did the law, so...
I mean, Glory, you're doing law with criminology, right?
Yeah.
How do you... I'm actually interested... I'm going to ask you a question. I'm interested to know how you find the divide of those two subjects, because a lot of the time people do study law with criminology or crim with law or whatever kind of combination it may be, but I think they get lumped together, but they are quite different, I think, right? So how do you find that balance as a student?
Originally, I was interested more in law, but while I was in sixth form choosing my subjects for where I'm going to be next year, I was under the impression that law was going to be boring. So I looked at criminology and crime, and like you said, it's really interesting to me. And I was like, if I could combine these two, it would really motivate me. And it really is, because currently we're doing public law and legal skills, and that has to do with like a lot of reading, and I am like finding it difficult, honestly, but I'm adapting, but then criminology is like, when I go into my criminology lessons, I'm de-stressing, and I'm like, this is so interesting, and I can like put that new energy into my law. So that's me, and it's just really helping me that way.
Well, that's good to know. Maybe I'm not a very harsh lecturer. I need to set more reading. It's going to make me go away and do some thinking.
When I started the Access course back in the days, and they still do the short course actually for people who want a taster in law and criminology. It's the 8-week Access course, and I started that back in 2015. I did 4 weeks in law and 4 weeks in criminology, and I did see the difference in the language. And when they did the examination of the course, they were saying, you're talking like a lawyer on the criminology bit. You don't need to talk like this. You can be more or less quite chilled out and just talk. But I did notice the difference, and I did enjoy the criminology side, the criminology bits. So
it's really interesting.
Well done to you, Glory.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, isn't it? I mean, the key thing that we're trying to do, there isn't a job at the end of criminology as a criminologist. People call me a criminologist now, but I don't know at what point I became qualified for that title. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, that was going to be the next question, actually, from Glory, wasn't
sorry.
it? That was like the final question, but no, go ahead, Glory.
Okay, so the final question was really, what careers can you go into if you study criminology?
All right. I jumped the gun a bit, didn't I?
Fine.
So I mean, criminology is quite broad. So there are obviously jobs within criminal justice, right? Whether that is policing, whether that is in prisons, working with vulnerable people, charities, third sector, that kind of thing. It's really broad. I didn't know when I signed up to criminology that my research interest area was going to be drugs. I didn't even consider that drugs was a part of it. And that's what I've now spent the last 5 years of my life researching to one extent or another is substance use and drugs. I wouldn't have even considered that affiliation, I think, before I started studying criminology and did a module on drugs and was like, oh my God, I'm obsessed with this. So I think it's quite broad. It's really quite broad. But the key thing, lots of students also go on to work in things like the civil service, not necessarily justice specifically, but other things, because the main thing that we're trying to do when we have a criminology graduate leaving us here at UEL is making sure that they are critical thinkers, they can analyse, they can question and consider, think in novel approaches. Now, traditionally, those have been referred to as soft skills, and it's kind of been considered a little bit derogatorily. But I think, especially with stuff like the increasing of AI, things like critical thinking and analytical skills and research skills are more and more valuable, because actually AI is not there yet. Being able to do those things. I say I mean, we don't know.
Absolutely.
But that sort of analytical thinking can be applied to any industry. You know, when I finished my master's, I actually struggled to get a job in criminal justice, and I ended up working in the music industry for 4 years. I worked in a sync team for music publishers, basically pitching music and then doing some legal licenses for their use, whether that was on TV or film or adverts or whatever, from the catalogue of music that we looked after. So even though that was entirely separate, you know, from anything criminology based, I was passionate about music personally. And then a lot of the skills that I developed in the course did still help me with that. Whilst I was working there, I worked on this thing called a trend report, because the music folk had never really considered this, but I was like, why shouldn't we try and analyse what the market's doing so that we can pitch more effectively, right? So I would collect all of the data about what ads are using, what type of music, what genre, what keywords has it got in it. And then I could create this visual report at the end of it. And we could be like, right, last year, pop was all across adverts, or maybe it was rock, or maybe the keyword happy came up all the time. And it meant that we could go through our music, or we could work with music, you know, writers, artists, and be like, look, this is what's happening in the world of advertising or in the world of TV. Yeah, slight tangent again, but I do think it was the skills that I developed from thinking critically and analytically that allowed me a lot of successes even in a totally separate industry. Which is why, again, back to originally what I was saying, study what you want to study. Study the thing that you love. The rest will fall into place afterwards.
So true.
That's all we have time for today, and thank you, Honor, for coming in, and thank you to our two students as well for asking the questions. To our listeners, thank you for listening in. We will be back, and we'll be coming back with different topics every time. If you want to get involved with our podcast, feel free to contact the Legal Advice Centre at uel.ac.uk. And if you would like to look into one of our law, policing and justice undergraduate courses, please refer to uel.ac.uk. And as always, thank you for listening.